I wanted to begin. So I have only lived in Miami for a short while. And when everyone warned me, when they found out that I was coming to Miami, they said that that I shouldn't have high expectations, that Miami as a city was all on the verge. And it had been on the verge for a while, almost like a fruit that was not yet ripened. But I don't know if I believe that anymore. And one of the reasons I don't believe that is you. And
Ah,
partly, I mean, partly because of that. But I also think you're an artist who can be anywhere, who could work anywhere he wants to. And yet you've remained in this space, this
right.
unripened space, maybe to help it ripen. I don't know. But you've remained in this space. And I wanted to really start our conversation by talking a little bit about Miami and how it's become a significant sort of site of contemplation, I guess, for your
Right.
work, and also how it connects to other considerations that really ground your practice. So some of the things that you can't necessarily see, that we can't see as your audience, but really informs the kind of work that you do.
Well, it's a generously phrased question, actually. And because what it is, it's almost all of us will make life decisions, so where we're going to live or how we're going to live, but it's not always linear, right? It's informed by the presence of others. It's informed by either tragedy or at times when it's um when it's right, is because we've made a choice. For me, there was no tragedy, to make that clear. But there was a choice. There was a choice of staying in Miami, staying close, in essence, to family, because it gave comfort. And one of that comfort that now at this particular age I've come to better understand than before was the ability to be, the ability to think, the ability to um, have a pocket of a reserve of space in which I can budge. At the moment when I was at that junction, which is in my case, it's date back to 2000, 2001. Um, and being in Miami and becoming a father, having extended family on both my side and my wife's side here, and the sort of positives of that sort of outweighed the sort of large fruits that the world promise at large. So that was on one end. But on another end, I had already begun to think about Miami in this very fluid terms. When I was in college, one of the works that I remember um, working on had to do with how Hollywood films, filmmakers, I guess, they will cite the production of a movie in one city and yet call it another. Right? It's like it happened a lot in Miami, that a movie scene would happen in Miami and they'll call it LA or they'll call it some other place.
Mhm.
And um, uh, in regard, I didn't really consider the sort of financial end of it, but I was interested in the scenography of it, right? The
Mhm.
scenography was really, it was done for the camera. It's like the camera will frame tightly enough that palm trees will become interchangeable, buildings of the 1950s will become interchangeable. Clearly, people wearing a particular fashion will become interchangeable. And with a dominant narrative, let's say two people standing in the street kissing, the story is really about the kiss, about those two characters. And secondarily, I mean, on a third level, forces the city to uh, step back and become mutable.
Mhm.
Um, that became an interesting idea for me really early on because it empowered the sort of imaginary of that one individual through artwork, through a work, I guess, can actually modify a thing as large as a city, or to be fair, can modify the perception of a city. And I found myself at this particular intersection that like, oh, well, maybe there's work to be made here in Miami that focuses on this sort of notion of perception as it pertained to me, to my life, to the limitations that, in essence, I had. And limitations are, again, the caveat of being in my early 20s and making my choice of living here. It's also, the early 2000s owes a lot in the art world's dominant practices to 90s conceptual practices, where I was attracted to conceptual practices like Glenn Ligon or Laurie Simmons, where the practice sort of developed with methodologies to create works, to create language, and that became more dominant than what on the outside seems to be a concern with a discipline or concern with a particular craft. So all of these options, I felt empowered really immediately and really early, and it informed, and I did not immediately see the sort of negatives of not going to New York City, or the negative of not trying to go to a residency in Berlin in the early 2000s. What I saw was, oh, no one is really thinking about the landscape of Miami the way that I've known it internally as a Haitian migrant who lived there for over a decade at the time, who knows the geography of Caribbean people more than I know the geography of white dominant class, because in the early 2000s I barely really know larger Miami, and for that matter I barely really know larger United States. But and also knowing that there's a kind of fellowship and language between immigrant culture as they exist in Miami. One that is not always exact with in translation of a particular cultural patronage, but it's close enough that we know what does a yard with sugarcane mean to a Haitian means the same for a Bahamian, means the same for a Jamaican, right? It's like, no, they're not interested in agriculture, but they're interested in kind of a sweetness with a history of a crop that was introduced through colonialism, but it no longer functioned this way for them, but yet it's in a yard in Miami, right? It's like, and how does such textures, how does such language become works? And so that's the scene for me. And I wanted to, in time, gravitated in making works with these textures, that has language and another culture under the dominant American culture under it. And so that was that's some of the early decisions.
So, in reading and preparing for this conversation, the word flaneur comes up a lot when critics describe your work. That's sort of, and it's a curious word because it means that you wander the city. You move through the city in a particular kind of way. And you move in a city where people don't walk. Miami is not a walking city. It's a city, at least not for most people that live here. It is a city for tourists. It is a city for migrants. It is a city for certain class of workers, and people who take public transportation. But for the most part, I don't see Miamians walking. But to walk and to wander, it suggests a certain kind of freedom. But at the same time, it suggests a certain detail. Like I am more aware of my neighborhood when I walk through it in the morning. I am more aware of the details of that neighborhood than when I'm driving through or just sort of coasting through. And to be a flaneur gives you a certain eye that you're starting to talk, you were just talking about, noticing these little differences, noticing the sugar cane, which I actually have. And noticing these different these peculiarities of the space and how it's marked. When did you start wandering in Miami? When did you start noticing and seeing and photographing these spaces in a way that we can see in your work today that informs the pieces even behind you that we're looking at?
Yeah, so I started making flaneur works while I was in college. So that's late 90s.
Okay.
At first, it started. I went to New World School of the Arts, which is in the middle of downtown Miami. Being in downtown Miami became a really interesting place to be a flaneur because it is the site of the city. It is a constructed site. It's elevated. Its signal, its civics, its civic section, its signal, its business section, its signal, this touristic section. Miami Art Museum is the museum down there. So its cultural section. And so the sort of mechanism of city as expressed through concrete and asphalt and municipal planning, right, became obvious. And so out of just the desire to know downtown a bit more and finding that I am wondering to know, but after such jaunts and wanderings, I have nothing to share. So at one point I decided I'm going to bring a camera with me. And additionally, I will take little notes that early on did not really go anywhere. But and so early on, there's became these photographs of either a scene, a view, or my body within the frame against a view. So these were the two dominant ones that early on signal a flânerie, right? Because there's very little difference between landscape photography and that and the movement of the camera of the artist with the camera, and so within works, me appearing within the frame definitely signal that this group of 5 images, including what function as a kind of a portraiture of the artist in action, function as the works of the flaneur. Definitely as a process connected to knowing, as a process where wandering, taking presence on the pavement, itself signal a kind of a presence, a kind of opportunity to observe, and some kind of recording of marking. I think all of these became the work. All of these became necessary, right? Any single one of them is not enough. And that's how it was structured. So I would use the opportunity of either going to school or the opportunity of coming back from school or the moments in between classes to go east, west, north, south, taking the long way home. These sort of gestures became connected to this kind of knowing. And this is, again, where I really meant earlier to the earlier moment of, while I was here in Miami, there was a little extra, right? I wasn't under the pressure of, let's say, leaving school to run to a job. It's like I live with my parents, and they encourage this kind of learning and observation directly and indirectly, right? And so yes, I had that, and I think I created methodologies in ways to be able to produce work with this with this gesture of knowing, and it went hand in hand with trying to understand what it means to live here. Here being the city of Miami, being in South Florida, what it means to move from urban centers, which is downtown Miami at large, to suburban neighborhoods and try to do the same activity, and why suburban neighborhoods seem to resist the sort of the public gaze of the flaneur. It just didn't function the same way, right? But the work tried, and these are some of the works that failed really early because it didn't really speak of a wanderer on an urban scale. It just felt like another body in a neighborhood, which itself sort of animated my more current body of work versus earlier on. But there's a lot of this.
When you say another body in the neighborhood, are you saying that the work had a kind of distancing that you didn't want to capture, or what do you mean by that?
Yes, the landscape of a suburban neighborhood sort of functions differently that of the city, and that what's more dominant is the domestic sphere, and photograph that is in essence photography within that sphere always wants to prioritize the belonging of that body in relationship to single family housing or apartment blocks that we see. Whereas it is a given within the urban center. Within the urban center, all bodies belong, all bodies operate within the machinery of the city. And my more recent work that takes photograph or within the suburban landscape, I happen to begin from the side of my own home, from the side of my own yard. So at least in my thinking, this notion of belonging doesn't need to be addressed. And so that's why early on there was some friction. Now there's another obvious friction. The other obvious friction had to do with the portrayal of race in American cities. I mean, the portrayal of race in American cities put especially a point on where belonging exists, right? Not within my own work, that wasn't a concern, but within the sort of distribution of the work, the question will arise. It's like, who is this body compared to this neighborhood? Do you live here? Do you know someone here? It's like those questions arise really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Or even it raises the historical question of belonging to that neighborhood. So those are the factors too.
Okay. So when looking at your work, we're going to get to the billboard soon, but I wanted to take a sort of long journey towards there. Partly because of our initial conversations, but I'm focused on these two works behind you for some strange reason. They're moving me in, and it's funny because the last few days another word has come to me when I think of your work, and that word is disorientation. And because anyway, a lot's happening when I go into that image behind you. And I want, in order to keep wandering around this work, to do my flannery, talk about the work in terms of disorientation, intimacy, capacity, and abstraction, and in the focus of the natural environment in this very produced city of Miami.
Right.
How those ideas sort of play together in your work, and how they're fun. They speak in some way, at least for me, when looking at your work and hearing you talk about these various spaces and the encounter of them, and recalling some of the images that are very intimate and in a sense ordinary in a way. But I actually like the aesthetic of the ordinary, and I like what you do with that in terms of intimacy, at least, and closeness, but also distancing. But you're also using it, especially on that image on the left, on my left facing, to disorient me, to almost situate me in a different way. Can you, am I crazy? Or, I mean,
no, you are on the right path.
So,
You're on the right path.
okay.
So one of the interesting thing that sort of arise in trying to make work, the beauty of a city, in essence, is that there's other people in it. Mm-hmm. There's other people layered in it, and people were and people are coming. But the confluence of people creates a dynamic of many things, of which culture is a byproduct of that. Politics clearly is a byproduct of that, and clearly commerce and is another one. But even the ordering of these things becomes immediately requires some negotiation, and in working backwards, right? Because we arrive in a city with the city fully formed. You either orient yourself around these dominant forms, or every once in a while you want to stray in new paths. You want to reframe the dominant order. You want to reorient the status quo. And I think this is one of the things that some of these works trying to do. There's a kind of viewing that is automatic, and especially it's not just the city as well, because it's also in the tropics or the subtropics, with our very dominant greens. Everything is green. The leaves are green, the bushes are green, the grass is green, the sky is a dominant bright blue all the time. It seems consistent in one thing, but we know it's not. And one of the ways to probe that is to sometimes work with the fragments of places, work with sections of them that are more open versus sections of them that are at the scale of not just of 1 million people, not just of 10 people, but at the scale of 1 or 2, right? And this is where intimacy arises, finding spaces where one body feels at ease, or finding spaces, or at least the framing of a space where one body can project their own sort of narrative within the beginning of what will continue to be the city. And those are the techniques in framing and narration that I'm trying to that I try to use in my work. And so disorienting comes in a way to poke and to question how this came to be, how just one yard came to be, how could one house came to be. Why is only the front of the house always used as to speak of all that has happened there? Can we use the side? Can we use this little wall here? Can we use this vine draping? I try to capture an object connected to the bigger thing, and then to go back to it, because I'm not so much interested in leaves. I'm not so much interested in flower petals. But I am interested in how those becomes the site where that may retain the presence of human intention, human narratives, or intimate knowing, or intimate expressions, or just the reiterating our humanness, just saying that, or and even the language of the billboard, claiming one's presence or claiming space for one to be, right? It's like those are registered somewhere. They're not just only registered in things like, lease agreements and deeds of ownership. They are registered in well-worn logs and walls that people sit on over and over because it is shaded and there's a breeze, right? It may be difficult to express that in a singular image, but it is the site where that occurs for me that's interesting.
Yeah.
It is the site that where someone drags a chair.
It's
Yes.
been tendered.
Oh,
It's
yes.
right, because you aren't interested in necessarily the people, because you don't necessarily, you don't usually have representations of people there. So to me, what you're saying to me, you're interested in what has been tendered, what has been touched, what has been shaped, and the kind of effective presence
Mhm.
of the person. And in a sense, that's more is that more true or honest?
Oh, it is very true and honest, right? Because we can use word to claim that the proper place to receive a person is in the living room. But in actuality, if we one truly observe, the most fun place to receive people is under the mango tree in the yard. Right? I know that for a fact. That's my parents' house I just described to you. Right? It's like yes, we can go in the living room, but really we just want to sit right here and we'll have a good time, and it will be honest and neighborly,
Mhm.
and probably more generous than the formal space of a living room. And
It,
so, say
That's
that.
so funny that you say that, because I'm thinking of my neighbors, and we're a very Miami community, very diverse community. And my Cuban neighbors like the front of the yard, and
Hmm.
my Haitian neighbors like the back of the yard. It's interesting, but those kinds of interactions rarely occur in the house. It's in the space.
Yeah.
And, I just find that to be very beautiful. But
and
sorry.
but it's also one of these things that may be a native language to hear. I mean, clearly, this can not happen in a place outside of in New York City. Well, New York City is not perfect, but way up north, where partly the seasons have really shaped people to really make indoors very comfortable, and indoors are truly the comfortable space to receive guests and family. But whereas here in the subtropics and the deep tropics, now we partition. I mean, we have such a architectural space called the Florida Room. That
Mhm.
is, it's a closed-off porch, but it is an architectural feature in single-family homes. That is a thing, and it's very productive. It is also very comfortable. And so, I Oh, and talking about intimacy and also abstraction. Let's address the abstraction part. So abstraction becomes the layer for me where legibility of what's happening is is being distanced,
Mhm.
right? Because am I interested in the blurred image of leaves, or am I interested in the abstraction within which leaves are slightly recognizable? Furniture is slightly recognizable. Definitely, there's a strong inference of human presence and the manipulation of the arrangement of these objects by people, a person who we may not have seen, a person who may have been in the frame a second ago, but has just passed, and now this image is taken.
Mhm.
Um, it is that abstraction that I'm really interested in. I'm interested in an abstraction where um, uh, it is not so much about uh, geometry. It is not so much about ideology, for that matter, or a school of art or design. No, it's an abstraction that is affected. It is an imprint, is an impression. It is, and that impression um, uh, will be read later on as a kind of evidence of some kind of a gesture or some kind of movement.
Mhm.
But really, it's only a summation of someone was here and someone expressed manifested thoughts and gestures connected to their being, and almost nothing else. I'm sure a lot more has happened, but those are the artists' work. I really want to make a claim that it is very important for all of us to feel both at ease to and even empowered by claiming a little something, by
Mhm.
possessing a little something,
Mhm.
even for a duration of time,
Mhm.
right? Is it a moment of rest? Is it a moment of observation? Is it a moment? Is it truly a possession of this is mine? Um, uh, this is also where notions of opacity and abstraction leads to notions of knowing, and a sort of a gathering of knowledge occurs within that space,
Mhm.
right? Because it is in that space of distancing from of observing the quality of the space that other thoughts of one's well-being, or other thoughts of one's companion comes into being, or language we've read, or and things comes to mind.
There's also an element of, well, when I look at the work, and I'm staring directly at it, it's a space of breathing. It's a space of
Mm-hmm.
breaths, right? And I feel that as I move through the work itself, even, and some of the sort of techniques you're deploying, in order to make that sort of affect, or to create that affect in your viewers, the way that you use these flat areas, these geometric shapes on the surface to really linger and almost bring attention to the sort of air in the space. But you know what I'm going to ask next, because that's the other, you mentioned it because it's something I'm fascinated with, is the blur.
Yes, yes, yes.
Is this notion of the blur and what that does in your work, because of my interest in Mofa King's work. But I want you to talk about that, and also temporality, in opacity, time,
Mm-hmm.
how you slow down time in a way, in your work, but also how that may speak to those, that ability to breathe, to inhabit this space that you're, or telling the way that you're telling us to sort of inhabit space, in this bigger space of Miami.
Mm-hmm. So yes, the there's also an interesting thing about, I think, the notion of thinking about how the flaneur is defined, even way back with Walter Benjamin. Walter
Mhm.
Benjamin privileged such a character,
Mhm.
such a being, um, to be able
Move.
to move freely. And is that the ability to move freely that gives one a sense of like one can breathe? What
Mhm.
the opposite of it is a constriction. The
Mhm.
opposite is a tightness that is not associated with the flaneur. Um, eh, and even in Haitian Creole, flaneur is a language, is a word that we use to signal that, to signal the freeness of a being who can just come and go and seemingly seem disconnected to responsibility and other thing.
Mhm.
So um, it is an inherent thing, that an inherent quality that that I strive for in life.
Mhm.
It is it's more than a quality that I strive for in art practices and art objects. It is in life. I just need to breathe. I just need, and I would really like it if those near me feels that sort of elasticity in space for them to breathe as well, right? It's not a self-serving thing, um, and and I'm gaining more and more space to breathe, not necessarily by the physicality of space,
Mhm.
but by conceptual reframing, right?
Mhm.
By more license gain through more by poetic and conceptual license, in essence.
Mhm.
And so the blur becomes connected to that. It is a softening of a sharply rendered image.
Mhm.
Now, blur in photography occurs either through movement of the subject of object,
Mhm.
or the movement of the photographer. But nevertheless, the space within which blurs occur definitely registered that time, there was a movement, there was a little bit of time. The frame happened multiple times within, the object was registered multiple times within that frame.
Mm-hmm.
And so there becomes, this notion of time and temporality is really embedded through a layer that is really hard to occupy, but it signals slightly more. It signals a pocket even, and I'm interested in that. I'm interested in how even rendering of a space, even doubling on an image, even softening and distancing becomes the mechanism for one to gain slightly more freedom in working, slightly more freedom through expression. And this is where, for me, where the blur and the temporality sort of locate. It's what they sort of locate, right? There is one of the mode of operating is trying to identify the different positions to work from within the sort of notions of space, so positionality. But there's a kind of a synonym, locality. It just seems slightly different because it can register not just nodes and point and space, but it can register time and sensation, and that is also very fruitful.
Yeah. One of the words and concepts that came up when we started our conversation, and what you just said brought me back to this, is this desire for a kind of utopic space, utopia, the notion of utopia. And we were talking about this, and of course, I gave the terrible example of Jim Baker. Utopic space against the apocalypse in Missouri. And you said, no, that's not what I'm doing. I want something else. And and what you said, I can't re-articulate it, but in that space that is temporally where time lengthens, where one can breathe, where all of this, where you can touch people and impact people and socialize in a way that's horizontal and not hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
Not Miami. Miami is not a utopic space for, but you have found this well, you're touching on it. You want us to be attentive to the fact, and I'm putting words in your mouth, and I want you to just shoot me down if you need to. But you want
these are your words now.
you want us, even in the complexity that this multiracial, asymmetrically power-driven space allows. You want us to be aware that we can inhabit a kind of utopic space, even if it's to enter our home and just throw off our, and breathe, and through your work. But talk. Am I asking too much? Am I putting too much weight on the work by even going there, I guess?
Well, for me, it is fair to actually put a lot of weight on works. It's the only way we know how well it can communicate, how well it can function, especially for a viewer. Mm-hmm. But the utopian is not too high. The utopian is proper, right? It is the aim for this body of work. It's, I hate to use the word inspired in this case. There's a kind of progression always toward a goal that is invisible. Mm-hmm. And that is a utopian space. We may not attain it, but there's, I think, even progressive work toward that end itself is rewarding. Mm-hmm. And some of the language that you use attributes to this. There is to pay attention to attend, to be conscious of not just our surrounding, but our companions and who's around us and their state of being in relationship to our state of being. These are grand. I mean, these are the language that political machinery uses to ask us to vote for their plan and for their candidacy, right? But outside of politics, and also outside of commerce that sells that. It's like, yes, you and your family, come on down and to this near beach where you'll be attended to and everything will be perfect, right? So commerce tries to sell that. But in the middle, it already exists. We already operate in a way where we want to be in a place where we are well attended, where we can drink our lemonade and eat fruit slices and lounge and read books of our liking and feel that we can breathe and our stress is reduced. It is not unimaginable. As a matter of fact, we can imagine it to a T, right? So now, how can we make work? How can we get there? Well, we don't necessarily get there by just working 9 to 5s. We don't work there by working dead-end jobs where we just get paid. No, that's not the real way. Part of the way is attempting to reshape the space that we're in, reshape the world that we're in. One of the works that I showed you and that just came to mind now is the language of Malcolm X, where he's like, he wants to join with everyone to change the miserable condition on this earth. It's like, wow, Malcolm X himself is utopian with this particular language, that we can join together and we can erase or change misery. It's like, it is attainable, it seems, because this plan is direct. And so is it possible that we can do it even in the spaces that are available to us? Is it possible that we can do it through the use of objects that have a special layers to it? I'm thinking art objects. I didn't want to say special, but art objects are more than they're just more than a chair and furniture. So they do endow a little more, and it is that interrogation that we try to get out of an art object. Can the art object signal for us a way to lean, a way to move, a way to be, a way to observe the world in order to attain or in order to move progressively closer to the utopian place that we want to be? I believe that's possible. Go
ahead.
Yeah, and not only as an artist who's all into art all the time, but it's even possible for almost anyone who find a piece of artwork that they really love, but they don't know why, but it gives them excitement. And that joy is true. That joy is true. They're not thinking about utopia, but they're thinking about, oh, this art object make me smile. And when I come from work and I'm relaxing and I see that image, it makes me smile. It's like, oh, for me, that's it. That's that conveyor belt toward utopia.
So you used this word signal a moment ago, and what these gestures that signal that you have entered a kind of utopic existence or space, and I like that. I want to go back, maybe circle back, spiral back a little bit to talk about that notion. You tend to photograph the outdoors. You aren't interested in the domestic space, it seems. There are no interiors. There's a movement, you leave that alone in a way. You leave that sort of interior space alone, and you move through the world, just taking in this sort of exterior space. Once again, in doing that, you sort of respect. You allow the person that may be on the other side of that wall to enact Glissantian opacity, right? What Fred Moten would talk about in terms of that you allow that blur to occur in that way. Was that a conscious decision to not do interiors, to not take this sort of domestic space, which I do also think that you're setting up as a moment, as a point of possibility for this kind of utopic experience. I mean, was all of that conscious? Did you explore?
I tried to make work indoors, but the works I only have, the indoor spaces that I had to work with in a control manner, or with easier access, I should say, is my own. Mm-hmm. and by extension, extended family, but my own space. But that's just keep reading as my own life. Mm-hmm. And my own choices. So looking over your shoulder here, I can see art object, and I can see lists of books. For me to enter your space, that's exciting. But immediately I'm building a biography of you, and it becomes less about because you're not responsible to the rectangularness of that space. Mm-hmm. You're maybe responsible to some of the arrangement, but some of that I know is unintended for to be expressed to a guest to your home. Yeah. A lot of it is some convenience and some of your own needs, right?
Yeah, it's almost as if you're saying the external is freely given.
Oh yes, exactly. So the external, on the other hand, all the layering occurs naturally. In the external, what we have is semi-private and semi-public spaces and overtly public spaces, right? Mm-hmm. Those are the three things that's in the external. Whereas in the internal, we have private, and more private. And part of the notion of the opacity is this sort of privacy, and what does the privacy does for the individual who holds that. And it is correct that one should respect the wholeness of that, even when that privacy is a confluence of a family. So it's a private space of 5 people and not just one. Mm-hmm. In order for me to work freely, I thought the semi-private, so the yards that I can see while I'm walking down the sidewalk, they still express a lot about who lives in that house. They still say a lot about their sense of their presence on this particular place, and even a sense of utopian projection, if one can go that far. And part of the challenge for me was try to read the spaces in order to try to determine who lived there in a way that is interesting. So clearly, some places just doesn't say much beyond someone lives there. The Johnsons live there. I can read it on their mailbox. It doesn't say anything else. But some of the houses, the yard is made, it's arranged in a particular way. The sculptural object or the planters are colored and patterned in a particular way. And there's no name on the mailbox. So I do not know the James of this particular house, but I do know their garden. And my God, they are really present. So that for me becomes interesting, because we also know, well, everyone on that street knows the James. Everyone knows that yellow garden house because it is so wonderful, right? And I'm interested in that. I'm interested, even though they still hold all their privacy, but within the semi-private, they can speak of language that they're sharing on purpose, language that I can participate in. And of course, there's another layer on the and the outdoors, which is that of the city again, which is that of the ordering on the municipal level or in the sort of country level, right? It's like Miami, for example, is still within the United States. It might be very different from a good chunk of the United States, but at the end of the day, it's still the U.S. So it is still an American place with sort of American values and American language that doesn't exist the same way in the Bahamas or in Haiti or in Cuba. It's just that Miami happened to have a little bit of Haiti, a little bit of the Bahamas, a little bit of Cuba, right? So that's what makes Miami more interesting. Um, so in reading the streets, even in the suburban neighborhood, we get to read who lives there on those streets based on what they offer, but we get to read urban planning and urban management and urban histories as well. And that also is interesting. And urban histories can appear in things like this is the site of a home where, let's say, a leader of happened to sleep here one night and made a speech down the street at the city hall. And I mean, these things exist in ways that can be really interesting, and especially when we think of the history of the civil rights movement, where a lot of the leaders of the civil rights movement, they move with a network of churches, and they were staying in in the bedrooms of, or in the extra rooms or the extra house of a church member, right? And that makes neighborhoods even more dynamic, right? The layer of history now is, and it's not just in the city proper, but it's also in the suburban end of the city. And there's no real way to express that sometime other than to say out loud that at 357 Elm Street, MLK slept here one night, and the next day he went to the church and gave a speech, right? And it's like, it doesn't really make that house great, except it does make that house more notable.
Yeah.
And that becomes an interesting thing for me.
Yeah, yeah. So let's turn towards the billboard.
Right.
Take some of these ideas and start to talk about the billboard, because I spent Saturday morning, part of my Saturday morning, just sitting in front, sitting, looking at it, spending some time just looking at it, and having coffee and thinking about it and falling in love with the site. And one of the reasons, the main reason, is that where it's located reminds me of something that I see across Miami. This moment where everything is being developed in Miami and redeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
So right on the corner where the mural is a small building that used to be a post office, right? And it's a one-story structure. It looks old. You're never sure in Miami, but it looks old. And the building where the billboard is installed is wrapped around it. And it kept getting more and more beautiful to me, because it wasn't just that there was this little building that's gorgeous and then the mural above it. It just seemed like a space of resistance in Miami that you see often in development, where people who lived in this city and have their two-story lean-to or wooden houses are refusing developers. So the developers are forced to build right up to the site, or build in New York, in this case, build around the building, because they couldn't get that person to concede. And that's something I like about in Miami. I try to document it every time I see it, because it says no, that those people in some of those interior spaces that are really saying no. And it's a resistance to all of the narratives of Miami, that tend to dominate, rather than the life of it, not the living parts of Miami, the narrative of Miami that dominates. And you see people who are living here pushing back and just saying, no, sorry, build around me. And in this case, the building literally wraps like arms around this little structure that insists on being, right? And in that space, your mural sits, right? And it's called Claim for Living in Love and in Trouble. Which of course brings me to the notion of text in your work. And I want us to talk about that. But I also want you to share a little bit on those words, the source of it, where it comes from, and how perhaps it is used in this context. You could have not put anything on it, but that text matters.
Yes.
That space of resistance. So yeah, let's talk about this mural.
It's actually it's a
billboard.
it's an interesting sort of relationship between the two buildings, right? That one is going around the other one, and the little one, the little one in essence is expressing some dominance in in its will to being in relationship to the other one.
Uh-huh.
And that is actually is in conceiving this billboard, that was not something that I was thinking of, but I like it more and more the way you express it, because I like the fact that this intersection, in essence, may be a recording of a kind of that sort of resistance to a type of relationship. I mean, a type of development that is historically have existed probably over and over in this city. And even the language of claim for living, and it's I like the connotation of the word of the verb claim, because it is so exact. It is also that of related to the law and contract and stuff like that. But I like it. It's not playing around. It is definite. I've made my claim. I'm claiming this for living, and for love and trouble as well. But that, and it is claimed. It's already happened. I already did it. The language for me was a very, so because Billboard speaks to the mass, is a mass media, I was interested in using a language that in its reading may find a lot more participant who agrees with that particular expression if they read it out loud as they pass by. And so, working on the billboard and knowing where the site was, I was really interested in, can I find a particular language that really operates on my thinking of what it means to be in this particular landscape, what it means to be in this particular landscape in a way that is both temporal, present, and where one can, and a language that's also project a sort of future use or a future intention. And this is the one that these are the fragments that I came to put together. The second phrase, for love and trouble, I borrowed that from Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives. And in Wayward Lives, there's a part where she's describing what it's like to live in tenement housing, and I think it's in New York at that point, and not Philly, but she's describing how the tenement housing they're small, they're tight, and many people are living in them. And she refers to how, because part of the book uses social workers and the reports of social workers to reconstruct a particular history. So in essence, in reference to the social workers who will come up to this site and only see the filth, the overpopulation, and the blah blah blah, and the vagrancy of young people and whatever. Saidiya Hartman says that even the hallways of these tenements were used for love and trouble. Right? It was an interesting turn of phrase there, because what it meant is that I don't think the social workers saw that the hallways were being used actively as an extension of space. But for the people who live in those tenements, the hallways were perfectly the places where one can have an extended privacy in the shadow for kissing, for being intimate, but also for trouble if you were caught there for various ways.
There's trouble sometimes.
Exactly. Oh, well, that's actually the key here, right? Because even before before, even before John Lewis mentioned good troubles, there was always good troubles, right? It's like you get in trouble not necessarily because you do something wrong, it's because you stand up for something against which a structure sees it as wrong. But
Yeah.
it is important to continue to do that. So for me, that's how trouble comes into being. Love doesn't really need to be explained, and clearly living doesn't need to be explained. But as a combination,
Mhm.
all of it need to be expressed, right?
Mhm.
It is ethos
Mhm.
more as much as it is poetry here. It is a way of being. It is an expression of how space will be used or want to be used, not as commodity, not as a kind of um, animosity between small buildings and big buildings, but um, but spaces that lend themselves for the intimacy of living, for the intimacy of loving, for the intimacy of conjuring action and gestures that may be seen as trouble. Those exist in somewhere. And the billboard features two photographic images that I collage multiple times within the frame to really expand that space. So spatially, the photographic images doesn't so much depict the place as it offers its textual qualities within which we can stand next to, we can stand around, and the same way the words sort of hover and are layered around these objects. Presence also stands around the leaves and around the blurs and around the sharpness and how light comes in. And so yeah, the billboard is making that claim, and it's making that claim on the street, on an intersection where thousands of people drive by and maybe hundreds of them walk by. And then there's a high school across the street, even though I think it's because coronavirus, there's no one there. But nevertheless, many eyes can see it, many participants of the city living, many who have lived, many who have expressed a desire for how they want to live may find alliance within the language in this particular billboard.
Mhm. Mhm. So, um, to sort of, we can probably go on and on, but to close off in a way, I want us to come back to that because that's a poetics. That's you're expressing a desire for experience for the city, right? You're
Yes.
expressing a desire, and I want us to talk a little bit about community. I want us to talk about this perception. Miami is, we think of the Miami model when it comes to museums and galleries, et cetera. But one thing that I wasn't aware of until I came here was the strength of the community, of the arts community. We don't hear about it. We don't talk about it here. But for me, more and more, I'm thinking that the engine of the place, of the city, in terms of the arts, really comes from artist-run spaces. These moments when I'm able to interact with perhaps the non-museum goer, the person that is just interested in culture and life and art and is trying to do their thing and is a waiter, but is taking classes at UM. And you know what I mean?
I
I've had
do.
moments like that have just been so rich that I've almost wept in some cases, right? And you as an artist, you're a mid-career artist. You've been, working in the city for a very, very long time, and you know it from various institutional standpoints. But I was really impressed with the space where your studio was, for instance. I mean, I like the ideas behind Oolite when they were doing talks at the Haitian Little Haiti Cultural Center and bringing in all of these wonderful people for us to hear from, to learn from. I like some of those initiatives that I see coming, not from the big institutions, which are fine and great, let them do their thing. But I like that there's a life in Miami with these sort of artist-run spaces or our artist-founded spaces now. And I want us, maybe we could close by talking about community and how, because you may not think so, but your work is grounded in that concept, in a way. To me, that's very strong. That the desire of that, the ethical relationship that community sort of depends on, I think, is a part of the utopia in the utopian moments in your work. So, I mean, maybe to close out our conversation, let's talk about these spaces in Miami. I know you're involved with the Bakehouse. I know you're involved with different things. How do you see it? What kind of work do these spaces perform in Miami in terms of a community?
Well, like you said, they perform a lot. They allow some. I would say my history as an artist in the city, where I was immediately embraced and where I was invited to participate in exhibition or first time someone asked me my opinion on a thing was within that context, right? But it's the context of colleagues, of either writers or fellow artists, or independent curators, who wanted to engage. And I think Miami is definitely a place where the scene itself is not super large, but it is complex enough that many of these projects, I think, contribute to a quality that makes the scene vibrant. Here at Bakehouse, where I have my studio, there are about 50 or 60 plus artists who have studios here, and it is very engaging. I mean, I think artists here knows that if they're working on something and they want an opinion, they can come knock on my door and say, hey, do you have 5 minutes? It may not be immediately, it may be tomorrow, but I will have 5 minutes for them. And why? Is because they're my colleague, and if they're working on something and we know what it means to work on something and it is so close, it is palpable, but we say it and we don't know if it latches on, or we don't know if when we say it out loud, if someone else is hearing it. And so I will play that role for my colleague. I will listen to him. I will give him, I will observe and look at the painting. Mm-hmm. Art is communal by default. Mm-hmm. In its making, in its conceptualization, in its distribution. Art is not necessarily about commerce. Art is not necessarily about its sort of a trajectory and distribution in high places. This is a side note, but I must say it. There was this really interesting podcast that I think the British Museum did years ago, in which they talked about objects in their collection. And one of them had to do with a mass of Ramses II or something like this. Mm-hmm. And thinking of what it meant for an Egyptian in the time of Ramses II, who did a lot of civic and a lot of cultural projects. Yeah. A farmer who's raising wheat doesn't really think about art in that way, I assume, but they think, I'm raising this wheat. It means other people can eat it because other people are making bricks. Other people are building mastabas. Other people are building columns, and other people are going to make another statue of Ramses II. Mm-hmm. Me growing wheat is connected to all that. Mm-hmm. In the modern world, it's very hard to always see how our participation in the city contribute to other things. Mm-hmm. But within the art community, one can. Mm-hmm. Right? This is the layer where you talk to a colleague, you give them a nice critique, you help them see, oh, you're on the right track with this particular work. That can end up tomorrow being a really strong piece of art within their practice. Mm. And it's not about taking credit. It's actually the other way. It's just like the farmer. You are growing wheat. You are sharing earnestly your a critique with a colleague, and that sort of layer of community for me is necessary. Mm-hmm. I make work in a world where there's other people in it, So the multiple communities that I belong, family is one of them. The Haitian community is another. The immigrant culture within South Florida is another. But the arts community is one. You know, not just the visual arts, but also other disciplines that I've collaborated with. It's these multiple communities. They function around. Well, they hover around me, or I go in them and out of them on a daily basis sometimes. And it is important for me to feel that I'm contributing to my communities in ways that is fruitful, in ways that is helpful, in ways that can help them see the place that they live in a progressive manner, that they can shape it, their desires are valid and contribute into making the place something more than it was before.
So in closing, I mean, so in a sense, you're telling me the fruit is ripening. The city is already ripened. We don't have to force ripen. But what do you want to see? I mean, where does this space, the vibrant, how do we get folks to see Miami in a way that's not like a Hollywood film?
Very nice. It's to see it at a scale that is very local, right? It's to see it at a scale where to be on 32nd Street, where my studio is, what it means to be in this neighborhood. And I'm in Wynwood, but being on 32nd Street has nothing to do with being on Northwest 2nd Avenue, right? When we go to the spaces in North Miami, like Bridge Red and 125th Street, to be in that neighborhood, to see artwork, what does it mean to be in that part of North Miami, right? Does it have a relationship with this immediate neighbors? That's the scale for me that it matters. And I want to see more of it. I want to see artwork in all these particular nooks and crannies. There are parts in Miami that it may be very difficult to show artwork there to that local community because of history, because of infrastructure, but all that can be worked out, right? It requires proper invitation. And a bonus actually of this current moment where, like, we're talking through Zoom now, it globalizes this conversation, while these conversations are still tethered to a local, right? We are here in Miami talking about Miami to a global audience, and that is necessary. And we don't have to, and we're not using language that someone who lives in Berlin cannot understand. And it is language that is applicable to Berlin as much as we're advocating for a more vibrant Miami. And so we can learn from our own histories, or we can learn how from other cities' histories. I think this is what my claim is entail. It's not explicit, but I think it is inferred. It's layered in there.
That's beautiful, Adler.